to be with everybody today. Nice to see so many friendly and familiar names on the webinar. I'm going to be presenting results from a new 3-year study of the NMTC program that we recently released. Special thanks to the Arnold Foundation for supporting that work, and also to my colleagues at Urban who partnered in it. So I'm going to share some slides and we will walk through some of the highlights of that work. Great. So we've got 6 research briefs that are up on this URL. And today I'm going to be looking at findings from 4 of them: project types, project locations, impacts on neighborhood firms, jobs and poverty, and impacts on local housing markets. So first, looking at types of projects, you've heard some neat and compelling examples just a minute ago in the video. What do we see when we look at the data over the life of the program in terms of types of projects? We did our own classification on this. We worked from data that the fund collects, as well as that Paul very thoroughly gathers and collects, and we did some of our own grouping and analysis here. And where we emerge is over the course of the program is, as reflecting recent times, manufacturing and food processing, these are by dollars, is the largest use case of the program, followed closely by retail. Then after that, healthcare, schools, and childcare. So these really are the biggest use cases. Smallest use cases, probably surprising nobody on this webinar, but affordable residential, investments in CDEs, forest, ag, mining, quarrying, transit, warehouse, wholesale. So what does that mean when we look at leverage? And by this, I don't mean the new markets, AB leverage structure, but just in the more generic sense of the term of drawing in resources that are not directly tied to the tax credit backed financing. And so here you can see some pretty notable differences by project type, where forest, ag, mining, quarrying are drawing in a lot more other resources into projects. Energy, water, and waste, for example, are as well, whereas the more service-oriented projects, affordable residential and services, are much more dependent in that way on the NMTC financing. Okay, so there's more in the research brief, but I'm going quickly for the sake of time. So if you're interested, you can dig into some more of the findings there. Including how some of this changes over time. But where do the NMTC projects go? This is an interest for every place-based program, but a special one for new markets, given that there are so many eligible places, but year to year, we only have a certain number of projects that can move forward. So over the course of the life of the program to date, there's 74,000 census tracts in the US, and more than half were ever eligible for new markets funding. That's not to say half are eligible right now. It's usually around 42% of the nation's census tracts. And of those that were ever eligible, 5,700 odd projects have been done through 17, that is, 2017, in 3,600 odd census tracts. So you can see immediately a lot more places eligible than got the tracts, as you know. And most new markets funding went to tracts, census tracts that had 1 or 2, and that should say projects, excuse me, but a small share of tracts got appreciably more projects. So there is a tail here of tracts that are getting multiple projects, though the most common experience is 1 or 2. And so when we look at the geographic distribution or dispersion of those funds, we do see some differences at the state level, and we did this analysis at the MSA level or at the county level or at the city level, and it's too much to put on a map and be able to visualize it clearly, but it is absolutely possible to do this analysis at smaller levels of geography. So starting at a state level, you can see some places like DC being most, followed by Rhode Island, Louisiana, Maine, and Wisconsin are getting the most investments, total investment per population in eligible tracts. So we are deliberately looking just at the eligible tracts, not all tracts in a state, and there is some variety in terms of the share of the tracts in a state that are eligible, but that is really, maps back to statute. So it's of interest, but that's more of a statute element, whereas kind of taking that as given, then where is the program funding going given decisions made by the fund and CDEs and investors and others in terms of what geographies are getting new markets investments. So we can see those states are getting the most, and then the ones that are getting the least, states and territories, I should add, Texas, then Wyoming, then Nevada, and least then are Guam and Puerto Rico. So those territories especially standing out as the places that are least successful or are getting the least amount of new markets funding per eligible person. And it's worth also lifting up and highlighting some of the differences in magnitude because they're quite large. So ranging at a high end to $4,700 per eligible person and a low end just $44. So the spread is pretty big. It's not just pretty narrow spread. So happy to talk a little bit more or put Q&A in the box if any of this is unclear, or we can have a broader discussion about why some of these trends exist. One thing that I did want to lift up as an emerging finding for us all to grapple with is some of the difficulty at getting community development finance into small and mid-sized cities and also into more rural environments. So this is a challenge that is well beyond the New Markets program. As you know, deal sizes are smaller, market rents are lower, but it still is a challenge before us as we think how to spread prosperity across our country. So for example, counties with a population above 300,000, that's 54% of the eligible population, but 67% of projects, 69% of Kiliki, 71% of total project investment. And really all of these geographies, it's not just the rural communities, but even these smaller or mid-sized places are seeing somewhat less than their share of eligible population in terms of projects and investment. And what about the attributes of the tracts that do get it? So we are looking at tracts that got new market tax credit projects. That's the 3,600 odd tracts through 2017. And then the eligible but did not get it. That's the 38,000 odd tracts. 3,600, 3,500 that did not get it. And so what do we see there is the population of the tract, pretty consistent. Tracts that got new markets versus those that were eligible and that were not were higher in their share of population that identified as Black people. So that is something that is evident. However, that is not evident in the share of people reporting themselves to be Hispanic or Latino. There is not, if you will, targeting. The program is not disproportionately going to census tracts that are higher in this share of this population. It is for Black. It is not a difference for Asian. For white, it is lower. So it really is consistent for these groups. We don't see targeting here, but we do to higher Black and lower white. By education, we don't see differences, which is interesting. Not big differences in terms of number of residents with jobs, so there is some difference. We do see lower incomes. So it is encouraging to see the program driving towards communities with lower incomes than is required of them on average by statute, and also somewhat higher poverty and higher rent or lower home ownership and somewhat a lower rent. The big difference that I want to highlight though as well is the number of jobs in the census tract. So these people could be living anywhere but working. These are locations of workers, these are not resident characteristics. You see a really big difference here. So this says that, to me, that on average new market projects are going into places that are somewhat lower income, somewhat lower owning, somewhat higher percent of Black people. But a really big driving factor is the number of jobs. So in terms of access to commercial and other job centers seems to be really determinative of project locations. Okay, looking over time, we see average poverty level initially increased. So it initially got more progressive. It was initially more targeted to places of higher poverty. It's leveled off and remained pretty consistent over time. So we have not seen the program continue to do better in terms of targeting places that have higher poverty. This is probably because so many factors qualify for the significantly distressed metric. Even though that has gone up over time, there's a lot of ways to meet that criteria. And it's a similar trend when we look at income of tracts, where this is controlling for inflation. It bounces around a little bit, but has remained fairly steady over time. Okay, let me draw in some of the impact findings. So this word is used a lot, and I'm not going to be language police for anybody, but when I use the word impact, I really mean a causal identification where we're comparing as best we can, which is imperfect, as best we can, what the effect of the program was relative to what would have happened if the program hadn't existed. So we have to create this counterfactual, like this alternate universe or world. What would life have been if that New Markets project had not located there? And so we do that through regression analysis called fixed effects, where we're looking at changes in places over time that did and didn't get the tax credit projects, and then we're looking at the difference in those differences over time. So a few metrics and measures that we're going to report on here: firms, jobs, and poverty. So what's the high level takeaway? Some pretty big effects, some question marks about them, and some of them are really quite sizable. So the first one is effect on firm creation. The estimated effect of one New Markets project is 17.7 new firms. And these are firms and establishments. These could be sole proprietors. So these are not necessarily, you shouldn't necessarily think these are all big, big businesses, or even small, but still, employee businesses. But still, nevertheless, a pretty sizable effect there that's emerging. Similarly, over 100 jobs estimated increased in the neighborhood as a result of a New Markets project. And again, this is not jobs necessarily directly attributable to the project. It could be, but it could also be spillover jobs, either in the immediate next door, restaurant or shop, or down the street, or what have you. And also an increase, though only a quarter of the size, in the share of residents with jobs. So these are jobs located in the neighborhood. People could live anywhere. These are residents who have jobs, but they could work anywhere. And then median income increase about over $500, and poverty rate about 2/3 of 1 percentage point. And then here are the numbers scaled to $1 million of investment. This is for the average project size. What we do see, however, is there was some acceleration in projects in neighborhoods before projects came online. This is the measure by firms. And so it appears to me, at least, that there is both a selection effect and probably an impact, a program impact. So it's likely that New Markets projects are going into neighborhoods that are beginning to accelerate in their firm growth. And then it's possible that the New Markets project continues or increases that yet further. And we see it for job growth, there really is not so much a pre-trend. It jumps up at the year the project delivers, but there's not really that pre-trend there. So that gives us a bit more confidence in that result statistically. And in terms of residents with jobs, we see a slow pre-trend, but it looks like perhaps it accelerates after the life of the project. So again, there may be a kind of complicated bundle of things here where there's some selection of new markets projects going into places that are appreciating. That doesn't necessarily mean gentrifying, it just means appreciating across these range of metrics, and then also pushing further because of it. So I'll go quickly through this for sake of time, but it's possible that all of those changes that we saw are explained by an increase in population, and increase that population. These are numbers of people who increased with a bachelor's degree, and a small 0.4% percentage point increase in the turnover rate. So all that to say, we don't know for sure, but it is possible that the gain in income and the decrease in poverty are attributable to new people moving in the neighborhood rather than people who lived there historically upgrading. Again, we can't say for sure, but the magnitudes of these could explain the other magnitudes. Not going to pause here, but in the briefs we break out, and this really was the point of the exercise, the results by project type. So you can go and see, are certain project types associated with certain programmatic impacts at the neighborhood level? And we have a strong reason to believe theoretically that that would be the case. So I'll leave that to you to dig into more. All right, last bit of detail here. Thanks for bearing with statistics early in the morning. Looking at the NMTC program on local housing markets. So first, we look at sales prices of homes. Again, this is not just for new markets projects that actually build homes. This is looking at the effect for a broader subset of projects and seeing what effect they might have, whether it was direct or indirect. And we do find, again, an increase here by this measure in sales price of new market projects with expected impact. We see an increase in the number of mortgages, and we see an increase in the average mortgage value. As before, there are some pretense of the neighborhoods going up before the project locates there, but again, it may well be a bump up after the project happens as well. So probably this complicated dynamic of both pre-trend and program impact that are working. And the same thing that we see for a number of mortgages. And again, we look by project type, but I'm gonna just leave that as something to whet your appetite. So I know that's a lot of material that I threw at you. Happy to get questions or comment further.